This is the southern frontier of Afghanistan. And these are refugees. Some 5 million in all are reported to have fled the conflict and entered the neighboring states of Pakistan and Iran. So great has been the influx that in some border areas of Pakistan they outnumber the local inhabitants, prompting fears that this could destabilize the region. But these are only part of the swelling wave of tens of millions of people across the world uprooted by violence, poverty, and environmental disaster. Refugees have always been the fellow travelers of persecution, conflict, and repression. But it was World War II and its aftermath in Europe which precipitated the uprooting of people on an unprecedented scale. As the barbed wire came down, the map of Europe was redrawn, and some 20 million people went on the move. This was the time when much of today's international relief framework was set up. At that time, refugees were a mainly European phenomenon. No one had expected that 40 years later, the relief agencies would be dealing with even greater numbers of refugees on a worldwide scale. Ironically, some of those resettled turned others into refugees. And some were displaced a second and third time.
I don't think anybody would be pleased from the situation we are living in. How would you feel yourself being a refugee twice in your life? In 20 years.
And at times denied the protection they needed. With the end of Europe's war came the breakup of the colonial system. Over 100 new states were formed. Millions were displaced as political and ethnic tensions erupted into communal violence. But the new order proved fragile. The division of Pakistan in 1972 was accompanied by renewed violence, forcing millions once more into refugee camps. Repatriation was the only answer. Increasingly, environmental degradation is becoming a major cause of displacements. In some places, the effects of drought have been aggravated by population pressure and unsuitable development policies. A vicious cycle develops as the landscape is stripped of its vegetation. Millions have been uprooted as a result. But many displacements are directly caused by political or military events. For nearly half a century, of fragile world peace has been punctuated by violence and mass displacements on every continent. Remote towns and villages, such as this one in El Salvador, have been repeatedly attacked by the military, who see them as havens for rebels. The entire population of this town have fled the violence. Many from Central America head north for Mexico or the USA. This is a queue for visas at the American Embassy in San Salvador. Others, leaving on foot, come to stay in camps such as this one just across the border in Honduras. Officially, there are 1/3 refugees in Central America. The real figure may be much higher. But it's been the newly independent states of Africa which have experienced the heaviest burden of refugees and displaced persons. The national borders inherited from the colonial powers took little account of tribal groupings, and political institutions bequeathed by the colonial powers were ineffective in comparison to that other legacy from the West, the standing army. The record of military coups across Africa is staggering. Over 70 coups in a quarter of a century. Against this background of unstable government, armed conflicts and environmental decay, African borders continue to bleed. Over a half of the world's refugees are on the African continent. Biafra was but one of many already forgotten episodes in the chronicle of civil wars and social upheavals. As always, the innocent civilian was the principal victim.
The members of the Defense Council and the entire people of Uganda consider me, I am the conqueror of the British Empire.
In Uganda, Idi Amin's reign of terror sent some 400,000 into exile into neighboring states. A similar number were forced to abandon their homes. Foreign powers have often been behind conflicts in Africa. The latest crisis is in Mozambique. These people have been displaced by guerrilla actions. Sanctuary for them is a life on the run in the bush. Most have not been able to cross an international border, so they're not even regarded as refugees in the traditional sense. This child was bayoneted in the stomach by a rebel soldier. He's crying out, "Don't hit me." Mozambique's famine was predicted, but only now are its needs being met. Today, most of its food is imported, and it's violent conflict more than neglect, incompetence, or the weather that's the cause. Those uprooted within their own country may have fewer rights than those who cross international frontiers. Unrecognized by the refugee conventions, they don't qualify for international protection. Ever greater numbers are moving to the rapidly growing cities of a developing world, many ending up on the streets or in shanty towns where they face harassment and eviction by the authorities.
की हात जोर जुलूम आहे गरीबावरती यायचं तोडायचं त्यांचं नुकसान करायचं चाललं जायचं.
कोणत्या गावात आला?
मी यवतमाळची आहे.
मग गावात नाही इथे कसं आलं?
तिथे आमची शेतीवाडी सगळी दुसऱ्या लोकांनी दाबून घेतली. आमच्याजवळ काहीच नाही. माझे मुलं एक होता 5 वर्षाचा, एक होता 4 वर्षाचा. तेव्हापासून मी इथे पडली आहे.
This is Khartoum, capital of Sudan. It's in urban areas that the relationship between locals and refugees is under greatest stress. Both are in direct competition for scarce housing, jobs and facilities. With 8 international borders, Sudan, one of the world's poorest countries, has received thousands of refugees from Ethiopia, Chad, the Central African Republic and Zaire. This housing project in Port Sudan will provide homes for 3,000, but there are over 60,000 others in need. A suspicion lingers that some countries receive refugees as a way of attracting aid. Yet, by readily opening her doors to those who need refuge, Sudan is already a net donor. Many refugees prefer to stay as close as possible to their homelands, so as to be able to return when conditions improve. This is where refugee status officially begins, a few hundred yards across the border. These people took months to arrive at this camp just inside Sudan. Threatened with rejection at the end of a dangerous flight from home, the trauma of being uprooted is matched by an inner emotional crisis. That emptiness of spirit only those who themselves have been refugees can understand.
Kuda. Magbi sini. This is 3 years long. انت ده بلاقي حوي هيجي انا حانت ده حلف كويس بالليل تعبها خلاص سمعها كميل كاتا دار بالليل نقر.
He died shortly afterwards. Refugees need meaningful work for spiritual as well as material well-being. But with a little assistance, they're quickly organized to help themselves. Here, they're decontaminating the local water supply. It's bringing mutual benefit to both local villagers and the refugees. And, of course, the children, ingeniously, make do with what they can find. Sometimes people are uprooted as a direct result of government actions. To regenerate its war-torn agriculture, the Vietnamese government tried relocating up to 800,000 people in rural areas. Many took to the high seas. They became familiar on the TV screens of the world as the boat people. At one point, some 40,000 were dumped onto this tiny island in Malaysia. Many had to wait years before being resettled. Since the last war, much of Southeast Asia has been an arena for the political and ideological enactment of conflict. This refugee camp is within earshot of the conflict along the Kampuchean border. These are Hmong refugees. Their story, with few changes of name and place, is similar to that of many other refugee groups across the world. During the 1950s, the Hmong were recruited by opposing forces to fight in a bitter civil war that was raging in Laos. On one side, a 50,000-strong Hmong army was raised, completely supported from the air. They soon became completely dependent on the aid. A whole generation of Hmong children grew up believing that rice came from the sky. They'd never seen it grow. But when the war finally came to an end, the Hmong were left in ruins. Their whole way of life had gone. Families and clans were separated. Fearful of retaliation, many went on the move to become refugees. Minority groups like the Hmong are often first to be blamed when things go wrong by those eager to find scapegoats. In 1972, the refugee phenomenon gained an added dimension with the mass expulsion of Ugandans of Asian origin. With the revolutionary growth of air transport, refugees had become immediately transcontinental. Within days, thousands were arriving in Britain. Some 64,000 were expelled, mostly to join the growing trend of Third World refugees moving to the northern industrial states. International jurists agreed that mass expulsions should be considered illegal. Many of these people were robbed on their way to the airport by the Ugandan army.
Well, they said, what do you have? Well, we had a ring, I had a belt. Well, they confiscated. They said that you are not supposed to take. They also took our money, Uganda shillings.
In 1983, the end of the migrant labor boom in Nigeria was abruptly signaled by another mass expulsion. Some 2 million foreign workers, mostly Ghanaians, were ordered to leave the country within weeks. The government blamed them for creating unemployment, the rising crime rate, and prostitution. Those failing to leave by the deadline were threatened with imprisonment. Within minutes of this border crossing opening, there was a dangerous push to get onto any means of transport they could find. Cattle trucks, heavy goods vehicles, boats unfit for passenger transport. Through the tiny states of Benin and Togo, they eventually arrived in Ghana, where, in an exemplary operation, the authorities mounted a massive welcoming effort, swiftly returning people to their own towns and villages. Meanwhile, back in Nigeria, the exodus had still not been completed. Whether people are uprooted by war, famine, or mass expulsions, it's the poorer nations which must absorb them. The industrialized states stand accused of not doing enough to help their neighbors in the south. The same states that send the aid, these tents, for example, also profit by sending the arms that fire the conflicts. This is the other side of the aid coin. The richer states have sometimes been unsympathetic to the refugee crisis. Asylum seekers have often been accused of using conflict at home as a cover to escape a crisis-stricken economy. The main reaction of the richer states has been to close their doors to the refugees. These chaotic scenes have been repeated at dozens of Western airports as people try to beat the new immigration restrictions. This is America's frontier of exclusion. Here, Border Patrol guards, using the latest surveillance technology, try to prevent illegal entries into the country. Many, however, are fleeing civil war, repression, or economic crisis. More people are arrested here than anywhere else in the world. 40,000 a year in this sector alone, trying to make the crossing from Mexico to the USA, many from the civil strife in El Salvador and Guatemala. But some 400,000 are estimated to have made the crossing. These were not so lucky. Some groups, such as the Sanctuary Movement in the USA, have been breaking the law by helping asylum seekers across the border and sheltering them, while others, lawyers or these nuns, for example, are helping them with legal assistance. The giving of sanctuary to strangers in need is embedded in many world cultures and religions. Today, that concept is being eroded as the developed nations increasingly reject asylum seekers.
Hand them anything.
Do you hand them anything? I'm reporting a whole bunch of them.
Okay.
Their attitude has increasingly been to ignore the problem or hope it will somehow go away. In 1948, 400,000 people were sent into exile from Palestine. Today, there are some 2 million Palestinians scattered across the Middle East, many still living in refugee camps. These are children of those refugees. Whatever role the international community plays in their future, one thing is certain, they'll not somehow just go away. The challenge to the international community in facing the refugee crisis must surely be to ensure they can grow to their full potential.